The sun was setting over the small, sleepy town of Pine Ridge, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. It was a place where everyone knew each other's names, and life moved at a slow, predictable pace. For Samuel Johnson, a 93-year-old, black veteran who had lived in Pine Ridge for most of his life, this evening was no different from any other. He enjoyed taking leisurely walks through the park near his home, breathing in the fresh air and watching the world go by. His cane clicked softly against the pavement as he strolled, his steps steady despite his age. Samuel wasn't just any elderly man. He carried with him decades of stories, memories of battles fought, sacrifices made, and lessons learned. But tonight, something unusual would happen that would shake both Samuel and the rowdy group of bikers who were about to cross his path. At the far end of the park, near the basketball court, a gang of bikers revved their engines loudly. Their motorcycles gleamed under the fading sunlight, and their leather jackets bore patches that marked them as members of a local club known for causing trouble. They weren't criminals exactly, but they weren't exactly upstanding citizens either. These young men thrived on chaos, speeding down empty roads, disturbing peaceful neighborhoods, and mocking anyone they deemed weaker than themselves. Tonight, they had gathered in the park to show off their bikes and let loose after a long week. Their laughter echoed through the trees, blending with the roar of their engines. As Samuel approached the area, he noticed the commotion. At first, he paid it little mind, thinking they'd eventually tire of their antics and leave, but fate had other plans. One of the bikers spotted Samuel walking nearby and nudged his friend. "Hey, check out this old guy," he said, smirking. Another biker turned to look, his eyes narrowing as he took in Samuel's frail frame, his weathered face, and the cane he leaned on. "What is he even doing here?" the second biker asked, chuckling. "Doesn't he know this is our spot?" Their teasing began harmlessly enough, with a few snickers and whispered jokes. But soon, their words grew louder, more pointed. "Yo, Gramps," one of them called out, his voice dripping with mockery. "You lost or something, this ain't no nursing home." His friends erupted into laughter, egging him on. Encouraged by their reaction, the biker continued, "Bet you can't even hear us over those creaky bones of yours." Samuel stopped, walking, and turned to face them. His expression remained calm, almost serene, as though he hadn't heard a word they said. In truth, every insult registered clearly in his mind, but years of experience had taught him not to react impulsively. Instead, he studied the bikers carefully, noting their arrogance, their lack of respect, not just for him but for the community around them. He saw beyond their tough externs, the insecurity, the need to prove themselves, the fear of being insignificant. One of the younger bikers, emboldened by the attention, stepped forward. "What's wrong, old-timer? Cat got your tongue?" he taunted, leaning closer. "Or are you too scared to say anything back?" His tone was sharp, meant to provoke, but Samuel simply smiled. There was a twinkle in his eye that unnerved the biker momentarily, though he quickly masked it with another smirk. "Guess you're all talk and no action, huh?" the biker added, turning back to his friends. "Probably spent your whole life sitting on the sidelines while real men did the work." This comment struck a nerve, not because it offended Samuel, but because it revealed how little these young men understood about sacrifice and service. Samuel had seen things they couldn't imagine, endured hardships they wouldn't survive, and fought battles they wouldn't dare to join. Yet instead of anger, he felt a deep sense of pity for them. They were products of a society that often celebrated noise over substance, aggression over empathy. And though their words stung, Samuel knew they weren't truly evil. They were misguided, ignorant, and in desperate need of guidance. Without saying a word, Samuel resumed his walk, leaving the bikers behind. To them, his silence might have seemed like weakness, but to Samuel it was strength. He didn't need to defend himself. His actions throughout his life spoke louder than any retort ever could. As he disappeared down the path, the bikers exchanged glances, unsure of what to make of the encounter. Some laughed nervously, trying to brush it off, while others felt a strange unease creeping into their chests. Little did they know, this wasn't the last they'd see of Samuel Johnson, and their lives were about to change in ways they couldn't predict. Back at his modest home, Samuel settled into his favorite armchair, gazing out the window as twilight fell over Pine Ridge. Though the incident in the park lingered in his thoughts, he didn't dwell on it with bitterness. Instead, he reflected on the bigger picture. Those young men weren't born bad. They were shaped by circumstances, choices, and a lack of role models. If someone didn't step in to guide them, they might continue down a destructive path. Samuel had always believed in giving people a chance to do better, and tonight, he decided it was time to act. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out an old, worn-out phone book. Its pages were yellowed with age, but the numbers inside were still valid. Flipping through it, he found the entry he was looking for, a name he hadn't dialed in years. With deliberate care, he picked up his landline phone and dialed the number. On the third ring, a gruff yet familiar voice answered. "Hello?" Samuel smiled faintly. "General Thompson," he said warmly. "It's been too long. I need a favor." Though the conversation was brief and cryptic, General Thompson agreed without hesitation. He trusted Samuel implicitly, knowing the veteran wouldn't ask for help unless it was important. As Samuel hung up the phone, he leaned back in his chair, a small smile playing on his lips. Tomorrow, the bikers would learn a lesson they wouldn't soon forget, one that would challenge everything they thought they knew about power, respect, and accountability. And so, the stage was set. What started as a simple encounter in the park would soon escalate into something far greater, a story of redemption, humility, and the enduring impact of kindness. The next morning, the town of Pine Ridge woke up to its usual calm. Birds chirped softly in the trees, and the faint hum of cars passing through the main road filled the air. For Samuel Johnson, however, this day was anything but ordinary. He had spent much of the night thinking about the bikers, their arrogance, their misplaced bravado, and the underlying ignorance that fueled their behavior. Though he could have easily dismissed them as troublemakers unworthy of his time, Samuel couldn't shake off the feeling that they needed help more than punishment. Samuel wasn't a man who sought revenge or held grudges. Over his long life, he had faced far worse than insults from reckless young men. During World War II, he had fought alongside soldiers who risked everything for freedom, honor, and justice. He had seen friends fall in battle, witnessed unimaginable horrors, and carried scars, both visible and invisible, that told stories of courage and sacrifice. But what set Samuel apart wasn't just his bravery, it was his ability to see potential, even in those who seemed lost. To him, the bikers weren't enemies. They were misguided souls who simply hadn't been shown the right path yet. With that thought firmly planted in his mind, Samuel prepared for the day ahead. After breakfast, he made a few phone calls, ensuring everything was in place for what he had planned. Then he sat by the window, watching the world outside. His thoughts drifted back to his days in the military, when discipline and respect weren't just words, but principles that guided every action. Those values had shaped him into the man he was today, a man who believed in teaching rather than punishing and guiding rather than condemning. Meanwhile, across town, the bikers were gearing up for another day of mischief. They met at their usual hangout spot near the park, their laughter echoing through the empty streets. None of them gave much thought to the old man they had mocked the previous evening. To them, Samuel was already forgotten, a fleeting moment of entertainment before moving on to bigger thrills. As they revved their motorcycles and exchanged jokes, one of them suggested heading to the outskirts of town for a race. "Let's show everyone what we're made of," he said with a grin. The others cheered in agreement, eager to prove themselves once again. But fate had other plans. Around mid-morning, the sound of helicopters suddenly filled the air. Startled, the bikers looked up to see 3 military choppers descending toward the field adjacent to the park. Dust swirled as the rotors kicked up winds, forcing the bikers to shield their eyes. Before they could process what was happening, soldiers clad in full uniform poured out of the helicopters, setting up barriers and equipment with precision. Armored vehicles followed soon after, rolling onto the scene like something out of a war movie. The sight was both awe-inspiring and terrifying, leaving the bikers stunned and confused. "What the hell is going on?" one of them muttered, his voice trembling slightly. No one answered. Everyone was too busy staring wide-eyed at the spectacle unfolding before them. At the center of it all stood General Thompson, a towering figure whose presence commanded immediate respect. Flanked by officers, he surveyed the area with a stern expression before turning his attention to the bikers. "Who disrespected Private First Class Samuel Johnson?" he barked, his voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. The question hit the bikers like a punch to the gut. Their initial shock quickly gave way to panic as they realized the gravity of the situation. How did this happen? Who was this guy? And why did an entire military operation seem to be focused on them? One of the bikers stepped forward hesitantly, stammering, We didn't mean anything by it, sir. We were just messing around." His words trailed off as General Thompson fixed him with a piercing glare. "You think messing around excuses disrespecting a war hero?" The general snapped, his tone icy. "Private Johnson served his country with honor and valor. He fought battles you can't even imagine, sacrificed things you'll never understand. Also, people like you could live freely. And this is how you repay him?" The bikers shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. Some of them glanced at each other nervously while others stared at the ground, shame creeping into their expressions. None of them had expected this level of consequence for their actions. They had assumed Samuel was just an old man, an easy target for their taunts. Now, confronted with the reality of who he truly was, they felt small and insignificant. Before anyone could respond, Samuel arrived on the scene, escorted by 2 soldiers. Despite his age, he walked with dignity, his cane clicking softly against the pavement. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the tension in the air, drawing everyone's attention. When General Thompson gestured for silence, the crowd fell quiet, waiting to hear what Samuel had to say. "I didn't ask for this," Samuel began, his voice steady and clear. "I didn't want these young men punished or humiliated. What I wanted was for them to understand, to learn something valuable from this experience." He paused, letting his words sink in. "These boys aren't bad at heart. They're just lost. They don't know any better. And I believe it's our responsibility to guide them, not tear them down." General Thompson nodded approvingly. Turning back to the bikers, he announced, "For the next few hours you will undergo basic training exercises led by my men. You will experience firsthand what discipline, teamwork, and accountability look like. This isn't punishment, it's education. If you take it seriously, you might walk away with a newfound appreciation for the freedoms you've been taking for granted." The bikers exchanged uneasy glances. None of them dared argue or protest, not with General Thompson glaring at them like a hawk ready to swoop down. Slowly, reluctantly, they lined up as instructed, their earlier bravado completely gone. The soldiers wasted no time putting them through their paces. Push-ups, marches, obstacle courses, and lectures on history and honor followed one after another, leaving the bikers exhausted and humbled. As the hours dragged on, the physical strain became almost unbearable. Sweat dripped down their faces, muscles burned and legs trembled under the weight of exhaustion. Yet amidst the pain there was clarity. Each drill, each command, each lesson forced them to confront their own shortcomings, not just as individuals, but as members of a community. By the end of the session, their arrogance had vanished, replaced by a profound sense of shame and gratitude. When it was finally over, the bikers collapsed onto the grass, gasping for breath. General Thompson approached them once more, his expression softer now. "Remember this day," he said firmly. "Remember who you are and what you represent. Respect isn't given, it's earned. And if you ever forget that, we'll be here to remind you." With those final words, the soldiers packed up and left, leaving the bikers alone to reflect on what had just happened. None of them spoke. They didn't need to. The lesson had been delivered loud and clear thanks to Samuel's wisdom and General Thompson's authority. Little did they know, this was only the beginning of their journey toward redemption. The morning sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across Pine Ridge. The town was still waking up, shopkeepers unlocking their doors, children playing on sidewalks, and the faint hum of cars passing through the streets filling the air. For the bikers, however, this day began differently. They had gathered near the park as usual, their motorcycles parked haphazardly around them. Their laughter echoed through the trees, a mix of jokes, boasts, and plans for another reckless afternoon. None of them expected that within hours their lives would be turned upside down. As they joked about their encounter with Samuel Johnson from the previous evening, one biker leaned back against his bike, smirking. "Man, that old guy barely said a word," he said, chuckling. "Bet he went home crying to his grandkids." His friends laughed along, feeding off each other's arrogance. To them, Samuel was nothing more than an easy target, a frail, elderly man who posed no threat. But deep down, there was a flicker of unease in some of them, though none dared admit it aloud. Something about the way Samuel had looked at them, the calmness in his eyes, the quiet confidence in his posture, had left a lingering impression they couldn't quite shake. Suddenly, the sound of helicopters shattered the peace. The bikers froze, their laughter dying instantly as they looked up to see 3 military choppers descending toward the field adjacent to the park. The ground shook slightly as the rotors kicked up dust, forcing them to shield their faces. Before they could process what was happening, soldiers clad in full uniform poured out of the helicopters, moving with precision and purpose. Armored vehicles rolled in next, rumbling onto the scene like something out of a war movie. The sight was both awe-inspiring and terrifying, leaving the bikers rooted to the spot. "What the hell is going on?" one of them muttered, his voice trembling slightly. No one answered. Everyone was too busy staring wide-eyed at the spectacle unfolding before them. At the center of it all stood General Thompson, a towering figure whose mere presence commanded immediate respect. Flanked by officers, he surveyed the area with a stern expression before turning his attention to the bikers. "Who disrespected Private First Class Samuel Johnson?" he barked, his voice cutting through the chaos like a knife. The question hit the bikers like a punch to the gut. Their initial shock quickly gave way to panic as they realized the gravity of the situation. How did this happen? Who was this guy? And why did an entire military operation seem to be focused on them? One of the bikers stepped forward hesitantly, stammering, We didn't mean anything by it, sir. We were just messing around." His words trailed off as General Thompson fixed him with a piercing glare. "You think messing around excuses disrespecting a war hero?" The general snapped, his tone icy. "Private Johnson served his country with honor and valor. He fought battles you can't even imagine, sacrificed things you'll never understand. Also, people like you could live freely. And this is how you repay him?" The bikers shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. Some of them glanced at each other nervously, while others stared at the ground, shame creeping into their expressions. None of them had expected this level of consequence for their actions. They had assumed Samuel was just an old man, an easy target for their taunts. Now, confronted with the reality of who he truly was, they felt small and insignificant. Before anyone could respond, Samuel arrived on the scene, escorted by 2 soldiers. Despite his age, he walked with dignity, his cane clicking softly against the pavement. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the tension in the air, drawing everyone's attention. When General Thompson gestured for silence, the crowd fell quiet, waiting to hear what Samuel had to say. "I didn't ask for this," Samuel began, his voice steady and clear. "I didn't want these young men punished or humiliated. What I wanted was for them to understand, to learn something valuable from this experience." He paused, letting his words sink in. "These boys aren't bad at heart. They're just lost. They don't know any better, and I believe it's our responsibility to guide them, not tear them down." General Thompson nodded approvingly. Turning back to the bikers, he announced, "For the next few hours you will undergo basic training exercises led by my men. You will experience firsthand what discipline, teamwork, and accountability look like. This isn't punishment, it's education. If you take it seriously, you might walk away with a newfound appreciation for the freedoms you've been taking." For granted. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances. None of them dared argue or protest, not with General Thompson glaring at them like a hawk ready to swoop down. Slowly, reluctantly, they lined up as instructed, their earlier bravado completely gone. The soldiers wasted no time putting them through their paces. Push-ups, marches, obstacle courses, and lectures on history and honor followed one after another, leaving the bikers exhausted and humbled. Each drill tested not only their physical endurance but also their mental resolve. As they struggled to keep up, they began to realize how much effort went into maintaining order and discipline. Simple tasks like marching in sync or carrying equipment became monumental challenges, exposing flaws they hadn't noticed before. One biker, Jake, found himself struggling during a push-up exercise. His arms trembled under the strain and sweat dripped down his face. Just as he thought he couldn't go on, a soldier barked encouragement. "You quit now, and you let your team down. Push through it." Reluctantly, Jake forced himself to continue, gritting his teeth until the set was over. By the time he collapsed onto the grass, he felt a strange sense of pride, not because he had succeeded, but because he hadn't given up. Throughout the session, General Thompson watched closely, occasionally stepping in to deliver lessons beyond physical drills. He spoke about sacrifice, about the men and women who had laid down their lives so others could live in freedom. He shared stories of bravery and resilience, painting vivid pictures of battles fought and hardships endured. Each story struck a chord with the bikers, forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves and their behavior. By the end of the training, the bikers were drenched in sweat, their bodies aching and their spirits humbled. They sat silently on the grass, catching their breath and reflecting on the day's events. None of them spoke. They didn't need to. The lesson had been delivered loud and clear, thanks to Samuel's wisdom and General Thompson's authority. Though physically drained, they felt a weight lifted from their shoulders, a realization that they weren't defined by their mistakes, but by how they chose to grow from them. As the soldiers packed up and prepared to leave, General Thompson addressed the group one final time. "Remember this day," he said firmly. "Remember who you are and what you represent. Respect isn't given, it's earned, and if you ever forget that, we'll be here to remind you." With those words, the convoy departed, leaving the bikers alone in the field. The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken thoughts and emotions. For the first time in a long while, they felt vulnerable, not because they had been humiliated, but because they had been shown a mirror. In that moment, they understood that change wasn't just possible, it was necessary. And though the road ahead would be challenging, they knew they had taken the first step toward becoming better versions of themselves. The days following the intense training session were unlike any other for the bikers. For years, they had prided themselves on being untouchable, rebels who answered to no one and lived by their own rules. But now, everything felt different. The memory of that day lingered in their minds like a storm cloud refusing to pass. They couldn't shake off the weight of what they had experienced, the grueling drills, General Thompson's stern lectures, and most importantly, Samuel Johnson's quiet but powerful presence. It wasn't just physical exhaustion that haunted them. It was the realization that their actions carried consequences far beyond their understanding. At first, they tried to brush it off as an isolated incident, a freak occurrence they could forget about once life returned to normal. But the truth was harder to ignore. Every time they revved their engines or cracked jokes at someone else's expense, guilt gnawed at them. They remembered how small they had felt when General Thompson called them out, how ashamed they were when faced with Samuel's calm dignity. Slowly, cracks began to form in their tough exteriors, revealing glimpses of vulnerability beneath. One evening, weeks after the event, Jake, the same biker who had struggled during the push-up exercise, found himself sitting alone near the park where it all began. He stared at his motorcycle, its shiny chrome reflecting the fading sunlight. Memories of that day flooded back. The burning muscles, the sweat dripping into his eyes, and the voice of the soldier yelling at him to keep going. For so long, he had seen strength only in terms of physical power, dominance, and fearlessness. Now he realized there was another kind of strength, the kind Samuel embodied. Quiet, steady, unshakable. That thought unsettled him more than anything else. As Jake sat lost in thought, a shadow fell over him. Looking up, he saw Samuel standing nearby, leaning on his cane. The old man smiled warmly, his eyes twinkling with kindness. "Mind if I join you?" Samuel asked gently. Jake hesitated for a moment before nodding, gesturing toward the empty bench beside him. Samuel lowered himself carefully onto the seat, letting out a soft sigh. For a while, neither of them spoke. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was comfortable, almost companionable. Finally, Jake broke the quiet. "I, wanted to say sorry," he mumbled, staring at his hands. "For what happened that day. We didn't know who you really were. Didn't mean to disrespect you." His voice was low, tinged with regret. Samuel nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Apologies are important," he said softly, "but they're not enough on their own. What matters is what comes next." Jake frowned, unsure of what Samuel meant. Sensing his confusion, Samuel continued, "You boys have energy, passion, even talent, but without direction those things can cause harm instead of good. You've got two choices now. Go back to the way things were or use this chance to do better. To be better." The word struck a chord deep within Jake. He had spent so much of his life chasing thrills and attention, never stopping to consider the impact of his actions. Now, faced with Samuel's wisdom, he felt a spark of determination ignite inside him. "What should we do?" he asked earnestly, surprising even himself with the sincerity in his tone. Samuel smiled again, his gaze steady. "Start small," he advised. "Help your community. Show people you care, not because you owe them, but because it's the right thing to do. Respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn through your actions." Inspired by Samuel's words, Jake decided to take action. The very next morning, he gathered the rest of the bikers and shared his conversation with Samuel. At first, some of them resisted, unwilling to admit they needed to change. But Jake's conviction, and the lingering memory of the military training, convinced them to give it a try. Together, they came up with a plan. They would volunteer to clean up the park, the same place where they had mocked Samuel weeks earlier. On the chosen day, the bikers arrived early, armed with trash bags, gloves, and rakes. Passers-by watched in disbelief as the notorious gang worked tirelessly, picking up litter, trimming overgrown bushes, and repainting benches. Word spread quickly around Pine Ridge, drawing curious residents to see what was happening. Some offered to help, while others simply stood by, observing the transformation taking place, not just in the park, but in the bikers themselves. As the hours passed, the group grew more enthusiastic. Their laughter returned, but this time it was lighthearted and genuine. They joked about finding creative ways to recycle old bottles and debated which tree needed the most pruning. By the end of the day, the park looked cleaner and brighter than it had in years. More importantly, the bikers felt a sense of accomplishment they hadn't experienced before. For once, their efforts weren't aimed at showing off or causing trouble. They were making a real difference. Word of their efforts reached Samuel, who visited the park later that afternoon. When he saw the transformed space and the bikers still working diligently, his face lit up with pride. Approaching them, he extended his hand. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice filled with gratitude. The bikers exchanged glances, unsure of how to respond. Finally, Jake stepped forward and shook Samuel's hand firmly. "No, thank you," he replied, "for giving us a second chance." Encouraged by their success, the bikers didn't stop there. Over the following weeks, they organized more community events, food drives for local shelters, fundraisers for veterans, and free repair workshops for neighbors in need. Each project brought them closer to the townspeople, bridging the gap between fear and trust. Residents who once avoided crossing paths with the bikers now greeted them warmly, grateful for their contributions. Even the police officers who had previously kept a close eye on them began to view them differently, acknowledging their positive influence. Through it all, Samuel remained a guiding figure, offering advice and encouragement whenever needed. He often joined the bikers during their projects, sharing stories from his past and reminding them of the importance of humility and service. His presence inspired them to keep pushing forward, even when challenges arose. One particularly cold winter morning, as they shoveled snow off sidewalks for elderly residents, Jake turned to Samuel and said, "You know, I think I finally get it. This whole helping others thing, it actually feels good." Samuel chuckled, patting him on the shoulder. "That's because it's supposed to," he replied. "When you lift others up, you rise too." The transformation wasn't just external. It ran deep within each of the bikers. Gone were the reckless attitudes and careless behavior that had once defined them. In their place stood young men who took responsibility for their actions, respected those around them, and sought purpose beyond personal gain. They learned that true strength wasn't about domination or intimidation. It was about lifting others up, even when it required sacrifice. By spring, the town of Pine Ridge had changed dramatically. The park became a hub of activity, hosting picnics, festivals, and gatherings that brought everyone together. The bikers played a key role in organizing these events, using their skills and resources to ensure everything ran smoothly. Children waved at them as they rode by, and parents thanked them for their hard work. The once feared gang was now celebrated as heroes, not because they sought recognition, but because they had earned it through consistent effort and genuine care. Looking back, none of the bikers could pinpoint exactly when the shift occurred. Was it during the military training? Or perhaps when they cleaned the park for the first time? Maybe it was the countless conversations with Samuel that opened their eyes to a new way of living. Whatever the catalyst, one thing was clear. They had found meaning in their lives, a sense of belonging they had always craved but never knew how to achieve. And Samuel? He watched it all unfold with quiet satisfaction. He hadn't set out to change anyone's life. He had simply acted with compassion and faith in humanity's potential. Yet, in doing so, he had sparked a ripple effect that touched every corner of Pine Ridge. As he walked home one evening, cane clicking softly against the pavement, he allowed himself a small smile. Change wasn't easy, but it was possible. And sometimes, all it took was one person willing to believe. Months had passed since the day Samuel Johnson walked into the lives of the bikers, armed with nothing but wisdom, patience, and an unwavering belief in second chances. Pine Ridge was no longer the same sleepy town it once was. It had transformed into a community where kindness and respect reigned supreme. The bikers, who were once feared and avoided, had become pillars of support for their neighbors. Their turnaround wasn't just remarkable, it was inspiring. People from neighboring towns began to take notice, sharing stories of how a group of troublemakers had reinvented themselves under the guidance of a quiet, unassuming war hero. Samuel, however, never sought recognition or praise. To him, this journey was never about personal glory. It was about planting seeds of change and watching them grow, not because he watered them constantly, but because they found fertile ground in the hearts of those willing to learn. Yet despite his humility, the impact of his actions rippled far beyond what anyone could have imagined. The bikers weren't just better versions of themselves. They were catalysts for positive change throughout the entire community. One crisp autumn morning, as golden leaves swirled in the breeze, the town gathered at the park for its annual harvest festival. What started as a small event years ago had grown into one of Pine Ridge's most beloved traditions, thanks largely to the efforts of the bikers. They had worked tirelessly to organize everything, from setting up stalls to arranging live music performances. Booths lined the pathways, selling homemade pies, hand-knitted scarves, and fresh produce donated by local farmers. Children laughed as they played games while adults mingled, enjoying the festive atmosphere. In the center of it all stood Jake, now the unofficial leader of the biker group. His leather jacket, once adorned with intimidating patches, now bore a simple insignia, a shield with the words, "Pine Ridge Guardians." It symbolized their new purpose, to protect and serve the community that had given them a second chance. As Jake greeted visitors and ensured everything ran smoothly, he couldn't help but reflect on how far they'd come. Just over a year ago, he and his friends would have scoffed at the idea of organizing something like this. Now it felt natural, even fulfilling. Amidst the crowd, Samuel sat on a bench near the stage, observing the scene with a content smile. Though his body was frail, his spirit remained strong. He watched as Jake approached him, holding 2 cups of hot cider. "Thought you might need a break," Jake said, handing 1 cup to Samuel. The old man accepted it gratefully, nodding toward the bustling festival. "You've done good work here," he said softly. "But remember, leadership isn't about titles or applause. It's about serving others without expecting anything in return." Jake nodded thoughtfully, absorbing Samuel's words. Over the past months, he had learned countless lessons from the veteran, lessons about resilience, empathy, and the importance of staying grounded. But perhaps the most valuable lesson was this: true leaders lead not by commanding authority, but by example. And Samuel had set the ultimate example through his quiet strength and selflessness. As the festival continued, Mayor Linda Harper stepped onto the stage to address the crowd. She thanked everyone for coming and praised the organizers for their hard work. Then her voice softened as she turned her attention to Samuel. "There's someone we owe a great deal of gratitude to today," she announced, gesturing toward the bench where Samuel sat. "Mr. Samuel Johnson has been a beacon of hope and inspiration for our town. Thanks to his guidance, we've seen incredible changes, not just in our community, but in the hearts of those around us." The crowd erupted into applause, many turning to look at Samuel with admiration. For a moment, he seemed uncomfortable with the attention, shifting slightly in his seat. But when Jake leaned down and whispered, "Let them show their appreciation, you deserve it," Samuel relented. Slowly, he rose to his feet, leaning on his cane, and tipped his hat in acknowledgement. The gesture was simple yet profound, earning even louder cheers from the audience. After the ceremony, several townspeople approached Samuel to express their gratitude personally. Some shared stories of how the bikers had helped them during difficult times, while others simply wanted to shake his hand. One elderly woman, tears in her eyes, hugged him tightly. "You saved my grandson," she said, referring to a young man who had once been part of the biker gang. "He's a different person now because of you." Samuel listened patiently, offering kind words in response. When the crowd finally dispersed, leaving him alone with Jake, he sighed deeply. "Change is never easy," he admitted, "but it's worth every struggle if it brings people together." Jake nodded, reflecting on the truth of Samuel's statement. He remembered the early days after the military training, the uncertainty, the resistance, the fear of failure. There had been moments when he doubted whether they could truly change. But Samuel's unwavering faith in them had kept them going, reminding them that growth required effort and patience. "We wouldn't have made it this far without you," Jake said sincerely. "I don't know how to thank you." Samuel smiled, patting Jake's shoulder. "You already have," he replied. "By becoming the men you are today, you've honored me more than any words ever could." As winter approached, the bond between Samuel and the bikers grew stronger. They visited him regularly, often bringing meals or helping with household chores. In return, Samuel continued to mentor them, offering advice on life, relationships, and decision-making. He taught them the value of listening, not just to respond, but to understand. He reminded them that mistakes were inevitable, but learning from them was what mattered most. One snowy evening, as Samuel sat by the fireplace reading a book, there was a knock at his door. Opening it, he found Jake and the rest of the bikers standing outside, bundled up against the cold. "We brought dinner," Jake said, holding up a large casserole dish. "Figured you might be tired of cooking for yourself." Samuel chuckled, ushering them inside. Over steaming plates of food, they talked and laughed, sharing stories and memories. At one point, Jake paused, looking at Samuel with a mixture of gratitude and curiosity. "Do you ever regret doing all this?" he asked. "Helping us, I mean. We were pretty rough back then." Samuel shook his head, his expression thoughtful. "No regrets," he said firmly. "Every person deserves a chance to do better. You boys proved that redemption is possible if you're willing to put in the work. That's something to be proud of." The conversation lingered in Jake's mind long after the meal ended. He realized that Samuel's legacy wasn't just about the changes he inspired. It was about the ripple effect of those changes. Because of Samuel, the bikers had transformed. And because of the bikers, Pine Ridge had flourished. The cycle of positivity continued, touching lives in ways no one could have predicted. Years later, when Samuel passed away peacefully in his sleep, the entire town mourned his loss. A memorial service was held in the park, attended by hundreds of people whose lives he had touched. The bikers stood at the forefront, their heads bowed in respect. Jake delivered a heartfelt eulogy, speaking not just of Samuel's heroism during the war, but of the quiet courage he displayed every day of his life. He didn't fight battles with weapons, Jake said, his voice steady despite the emotion in his eyes. He fought them with love, patience, and belief in humanity. And in doing so, he changed the world, one heart at a time. Samuel's memory lived on in Pine Ridge, not through statues or monuments, but through the actions of those he inspired. The park where it all began became a symbol of unity, hosting events that celebrated community and compassion. And whenever someone new moved to town, they were told the story of Samuel Johnson, the man who believed in second chances and showed everyone that kindness could conquer even the toughest of hearts. In the end, Samuel's greatest triumph wasn't the transformation of the bikers or the revitalization of Pine Ridge. It was the reminder that within every person lies the potential for greatness, if only someone believes in them enough to unlock it. And sometimes, all it takes is one act of kindness, one moment of understanding to spark a chain reaction that changes lives forever.